Neighbors in the high valley laughed when the mountain man started building a second wall around his cabin, 3 feet out in a perfect ring, stuffed with pine needles and bark. They called it pointless, paranoid, even insane. But the blizzard that hit 2 months later proved it was the only reason he survived. While most homesteaders in the upper basin finished chopping firewood and patching roof shingles before winter, there was one man who seemed to be building backward. Thomas "Tom" Keller, a soft-spoken mountain trapper who lived half a mile above the nearest road, began erecting a second wall around his entire log cabin, something nobody in the valley had seen before. He set rough-cut pine posts 3 feet out from his existing walls, forming a rectangular frame around the home he had lived in for nearly 15 years. Locals hiking past the trailhead saw him hauling piles of pine needles, dry bark, and forest duff, materials they tossed aside while clearing campsites. People shook their heads. A properly chinked cabin was enough, they said. A smart man sealed gaps, burned spruce, and kept the fire fed. Keller kept working. He'd learned a different lesson. Keller had grown up in the mountains of northern Montana, where temperatures could drop 40 degrees overnight and winds threw drifts taller than a man across the ridgelines. His father had taught him early that heat didn't escape through walls. It was ripped away by moving air. In the logging camps where Tom worked as a teenager, the bunkhouses were built with double plank walls and packed sawdust that kept them warm through the coldest Januaries. Years later, an older Crow elder showed him the same principle in teepee winter liners. Still air between layers was stronger insulation than logs alone. So when Keller built his own cabin above Sierra Ridge, he eventually realized the wind was his real enemy, not the cold. By mid-September, his logs were sealed tight, his chimney was repaired, and his firewood stacked head-high. But instead of resting, he started his strange project. He dug shallow trenches around his cabin, planted sturdy posts, and began creating what looked, at first glance, like a fence built uncomfortably close to the building. The second wall took shape slowly. 2x3s braced each post at 40-inch intervals. He laid horizontal slats, notched precisely, leaving a narrow vent near the eaves for moisture to escape. At ground level, he installed a half-inch gap screened with wire mesh. The frame was soon wrapped in rough, thin pine boards, their edges sealed by overlapping battens Keller cut by hand. "Looks like a coffin around a house," one neighbor joked during an early morning supply run. "Looks like he's losing it up there," another said. But Keller ignored them. In late September, he began gathering the fill, something no one expected. Instead of straw or hay, which the valley farmers used, he collected pine needles, bark shreds, and forest duff. Every afternoon, he could be seen hauling burlap sacks down the trail, emptying them into the cavity between the inner cabin and the outer wall. The material was dry, fibrous, springy, exactly what he wanted, and he packed it lightly, never compressing it fully. He spent 3 weeks on this task, long after the first frosts made the mountain mornings bite. Neighbors from the safety of the valley muttered among themselves, "He's insulating with trash. That stuff will rot. Animals'll nest in it. What a waste of lumber." Keller didn't bother correcting them. He knew what he was building: a dead air barrier, an outer skin to take the wind, a buffer to keep the inner cabin in stillness. By the first week of October, the wall was done. He sealed the top with tar paper and sheet metal flashing to shed meltwater away from the gap. Around windows and the door, he built hinged shutters of outer planking so he could access the space if needed. The result looked bizarre, but Keller smiled when he stepped inside that night. For the first time in years, The cabin felt quiet. No draft crawling across the floor. No whistle of wind squeezing through the chinking. Just stillness. The valley laughed, but the mountain does not care who laughs. On November 2nd, the blizzard started. No warnings from the Forestry Service. No low pressure. No signs in the clouds. Just a sudden wall of white wind slamming into Sierra Ridge with gusts over 80 man and twice a man. Snow rose from the ground as much as it fell from the sky. Entire tree lines vanished behind swirling white curtains. Down in the valley, families scrambled to keep fires going. Smoke bent sideways from chimneys. Inside their cabins, heat fled the moment it left the stove, pulled through cracks and gaps by the storm's force. Temperatures dropped so fast that people huddled in layers near burning stoves, losing the fight minute by minute. At the Johnson cabin, water froze solid in tin cups sitting 3 feet from the fire. At the Miller home, frost formed inside the walls. Doors rattled violently. Children woke up crying from the cold. Meanwhile, halfway up the mountain, Keller woke to a quiet cabin. He banked his fire at midnight like he always did. Yet at dawn, the interior was still 18 degrees warmer than the night before. His thermometer, an old gift from his logging camp days, read 51 degrees inside. Outside? The storm roared at 19 degrees. Keller put on a coat, stepped outside, and watched snow whip, sideways, around the outer wall. The second skin took the beating. Wind rammed through the tiny cracks between the planks, and died there. The pine needle fill trapped thousands of pockets of still air, stopping the convection dead in its tracks. The inner cabin stood untouched, while other homesteads burned through 2 days' worth of firewood just to keep their homes barely above freezing. Keller used just 4 logs through the night. On the second day of the storm, families realized something was very wrong when Keller's chimney smoke rose straight up, calm, steady, while theirs curled violently in the wind. They strapped on snowshoes and made the brutal climb to Keller's place. What they found stunned them. Inside, Keller brewed coffee in a shirt sleeve. No frost on the walls, no drafts, water completely liquid in his buckets. The inner cabin sat in a cocoon of perfect stillness, protected by the outer wall absorbing the full force of the storm. When he explained how it worked, dead air trapped between fibrous fill, neighbors stared in disbelief. "That's it?" one asked. "That's insulation," Keller said. They shook their heads. They stopped laughing. On the third day, the storm worsened. The valley cabins cracked, creaked, and shuddered. One family's roof nearly tore away. By the fourth day, families with children and elderly members begged Keller for shelter. He opened his door without hesitation. 11 people crowded into the small cabin, warmed instantly by the steady temperatures the double wall maintained. The blizzard lasted 6 days. People survived because of a man they thought was crazy. When spring arrived, nearly every homesteader in the valley built some version of Keller's second wall. Some used straw, others used sawdust. A few even copied his pine needle method exactly. But by then, no one laughed at the sight. Because everyone remembered the truth the blizzard had written plainly across their cabins. A single wall fights the wind. A double wall defeats it. Keller never cared for praise. He rebuilt a section of his outer wall where a fallen branch had dented it, and said nothing more. But in Sierra Ridge, the winter of 1978 became a legend. A story passed between homesteaders, hikers, and mountain families for decades. The mountain man who built a second wall around his cabin, the one everyone mocked, was the only one prepared when the storm came. When the storm finally died down and the valley thawed again weeks later, The story of Tom Keller's survival spread across Sierra Ridge faster than any snowmelt. People who once mocked him now treated him like a living almanac, one whose lessons were written in timber and frost instead of ink. Keller didn't welcome the attention, but he didn't push it away either. He simply returned to his routine, checking his snares, cutting deadfall, and stacking wood in quiet rows. Yet everyone who visited him noticed the same thing. His cabin still radiated the calm, insulated warmth that had saved a dozen lives. But the winter had done more than prove Keller right. It had changed the valley itself. Homesteaders who had survived on luck felt uneasy now. They saw how fragile their preparations were compared to his. That unease grew into determination. By late spring, farmers began asking Keller questions, real ones, not sarcastic comments tossed casually over fences. He answered politely, sometimes even drawing rough sketches in the dirt to explain airflow, convection, and structural buffering. People who'd barely spoken to him in years now stopped by his cabin regularly. They wanted to learn, and Keller, quietly, wanted them to survive. Not everyone welcomed the shift. Some valley families bristled at the idea that a solitary trapper knew better than generations of homesteaders. "We've been building cabins long before he got here," one man muttered at the general store. Storm was a fluke. But denial cracked easily when patched roofs sagged from meltwater damage, or when families compared firewood logs burned during the blizzard. The truth wasn't subtle, and despite pride and tradition, necessity always wins. By June, nearly every household had at least started planning a second wall, though few understood the details well enough to build one right. One family in particular struggled more than the rest, the Andrews family, whose cabin had barely survived the storm. Their logs were old, their windows drafty, their money tight. Jack Andrews approached Keller with a mix of embarrassment and desperation. "I don't have enough lumber," he said. Keller studied the old cabin, leaning, patched, scarred by weather, and nodded. "Then we use what you have," he said. For the next 2 weeks, they stripped fallen trees, milled rough planks by hand, and scavenged bark insulation from the forest floor. Neighbors watched, slowly realizing the truth. The mountain doesn't reward pride. It rewards effort. Of all the designs people copied, none worked as well as Keller's pine duff fill. It wasn't just the material. It was the way he arranged it, light, airy, layered in alternating densities, so air pockets formed naturally. He explained it to anyone who asked, usually while sharpening his axe or hauling wood. "Still air insulates," he said simply. "Not heavy bundles." But most people packed their walls too tightly, turning natural insulation into cold bridges. Keller tried to correct them gently, adjusting panels, loosening fill, adding small vents along the top. Some listened. Others ignored him. Winter would show who learned. As summer approached, Keller helped rebuild more cabins than he expected. He wasn't a carpenter by trade, but his hands were steady, and decades of mountain living had taught him efficiency. Men who once mocked him now followed his movements like apprentices. Women who once joked about his weird fence brought him jars of pickled beans or fresh bread in thanks. Children watched curiously, whispering legends about the man whose magic wall saved everyone from freezing. Keller smiled politely, but avoided the praise. In his mind, he'd done nothing extraordinary. He just listened to the mountain and acted early. During one rebuilding project, a neighbor named Harris questioned Keller directly. "Why'd you build it when you did? Storm hadn't even been forecast." Keller paused. Explaining intuition wasn't simple. He finally said, The wind sounded different last fall, more hollow. Harris frowned, unsure how to respond. Keller saw the confusion. Mountains aren't silent, he said, but when they change their tune, you'd better pay attention. That remark traveled across the valley. Some repeated it respectfully, others mocked it. But when the ridge line shifted again, small tremors barely felt in the valley. People remembered Keller's words and listened. In mid-July, something strange happened. A team of forestry rangers hiked up to Keller's cabin to inspect storm damage along the upper trails. They noticed his second wall immediately. One ranger walked around it twice, touching the boards. "Never seen anything like this," he said. Another ranger asked questions. Structural load, moisture control, airflow. Keller answered calmly. The rangers exchanged glances. "Mind if we take measurements?" they asked. Keller shrugged. "If it helps someone." For the first time, outsiders, not neighbors, saw the brilliance of his design. They documented everything, sketched diagrams, even took temperature readings inside. The rangers returned to the valley and shared their findings. Word spread quickly. Within a month, rumors circulated that state officials were interested in Keller's system as a potential low-cost insulation method for remote ranger stations. That news stirred the valley in ways no storm ever had. Some residents feared outside attention, worried it would disrupt their quiet mountain life. Others saw opportunity. If Keller's technique gained recognition, the valley might finally receive funding for better roads or services. Through it all, Keller remained unchanged. He still worked alone, still avoided crowds, still preferred the sound of wind to chatter. But attention rarely comes without an unintended cost. In late August, 2 unfamiliar men arrived in the valley. They drove a shiny truck, wore clean boots, and carried clipboards, out of place in the dusty mountain roads. They introduced themselves as consultants, but their questions felt sharp. They asked about Keller's design, his cabin, his methods, even his personal background. Residents felt uneasy. "They talk like they're buying something," the store clerk whispered. When they tried visiting Keller's cabin without invitation, he refused to open the door. "Don't need anything," he said firmly. The men drove off, but didn't leave. For several days, the strangers lingered around the trailheads, observing cabins and taking photos. They interviewed families about storm experiences and energy usage. The valley tightened with suspicion. Mountain folk protect their own, especially after a hard winter. Some neighbors confronted the men politely but firmly, telling them to leave Keller alone. The strangers claimed they were simply conducting a study. But valley residents recognized the tone. Too polished, too rehearsed. Keller advised everyone, "Don't tell them anything you don't want printed." His voice was calm, but his eyes carried a quiet warning. Things were changing. That week, Keller began reinforcing his second wall. Not patching, fortifying. He added vertical braces, tightened the flashing along the roof line, checked for moisture buildup, and cleared the vent spaces carefully. Neighbors noticed. "You expecting another storm?" a boy asked him while delivering eggs. Keller didn't answer directly. He just said, "Mountain seasons don't apologize for coming early." The boy didn't understand then, but adults watching from a distance did. Keller was preparing again. Whether for weather or people, no one knew. But when he prepared, the valley paid attention. Somewhere in the air, something felt unsettled. By September, the strange men returned, this time with more polished language and thin, printed brochures offering to partner with rural innovators. They tried approaching Keller at the post office, He listened politely for almost a full minute before closing the brochure and handing it back. Mountain solves its problems fine without partnerships, he said. They insisted they could scale his idea, monetize it, maximize impact. Keller's jaw tightened. Impact isn't always improvement, he said. The conversation ended coldly. Neighbors watched the exchange from the street, some with admiration, some with fear, because people who want something don't give up easily. The men left again, but were spotted near Keller's trail days later. Someone saw them taking measurements near his cabin when he wasn't home. That was the final straw for the valley. A group of locals confronted them directly. "This isn't city property," an older woman said sharply. "You're trespassing." The men backed off under pressure, promising they were leaving. But the quiet anger in the valley grew. People began checking on Keller more often, not out of pity, but solidarity. Mountain communities may joke, argue, or doubt each other, but intruders unify them faster than any storm. Keller, meanwhile, prepared for winter in his usual meticulous way. He restacked his woodpile, repaired his chimney cap, and sealed his windows twice. He inspected the outer wall almost daily, making small adjustments with a carpenter's patience. But he also did something new. He began building a reinforced inner shelf inside the cavity of the second wall. Small, narrow planks, perfectly measured. When asked why, he simply said, "Wind's changing direction this year." The explanation satisfied most neighbors, but a few sensed something deeper, a sense that Keller wasn't just preparing for weather anymore. The first cold snap arrived early on October 14th. Not dangerous, but sharp, a reminder. Frost crept along the rooftops in delicate white feathers. Pipes in poorly insulated homes groaned. Keller's cabin remained calm. Temperatures inside barely shifted. Children walking to school could see thin plumes of steam rising gently from his stovepipe, while theirs shook violently in the wind. Some parents joked, "Maybe we should all move into Keller's place." But behind the humor was a plea: teach us how to stay warm. In the valley, winter wasn't a season, it was a test, and Keller had passed the last one flawlessly. By late October, families began approaching Keller again, not for help building walls this time, but for advice on food storage, emergency heating, and storm signaling. The blizzard had made everyone cautious. Keller didn't mind guiding them. He simply shared what he knew. One afternoon, he held a small workshop near the general store, showing how to pack emergency duff walls inside bedrooms using nothing but canvas and forest duff. People listened with the rapt attention normally reserved for doctors. Even skeptics leaned in. Knowledge became currency, and Keller spent it freely. But Keller noticed something new. Animals were behaving strangely. Birds migrated weeks early. Elk moved farther down the slopes than usual. Coyotes howled at odd hours. Keller had lived on the ridge long enough to recognize these signs. Nature whispered warnings long before storms roared, and this time the whispers felt urgent. He walked the high ridge trails more often, studying the snow patches, the tree lines, the wind direction. Something heavy brewed in the mountains, something bigger than last winter. He didn't panic. He didn't speak loudly of it. He simply prepared. One day, while Keller was splitting wood, he heard footsteps approaching the cabin. Expecting a neighbor, he looked up, but it was the strangers again. They stood several feet away, hands raised in a show of peace. "We want to talk," one said. Keller set down his axe, but didn't invite them closer. They spoke about opportunity, innovation, partnerships. They framed his design as something too valuable to keep isolated. Keller listened quietly, then shook his head. "It kept my neighbors alive," he said. "That's all the value it needs." The men exchanged a look, the kind that meant future trouble. That night, Keller couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest outside his cabin creaked naturally, but some sounds felt different, intentional, measured. He stayed awake longer than usual, tending the fire, listening. Twice he stepped outside with his lantern. Nothing moved except the wind brushing through the trees. Still, he reinforced the barn door and double-checked the locks on the cabin. If the mountain warned him through weather, it also warned him through intuition. And Keller had survived this long because he trusted both. The valley noticed the tension too. People whispered about the strangers at the store, the trailheads, the diner. Some thought they were harmless. Annoying, but harmless. Others believed they wanted to exploit Keller's idea commercially. A few suspected darker motives. Why take photos of his cabin? Someone asked. Why hike up the ridge during storms? Another wondered. Questions piled up like firewood. Answers were scarce. But one thing was clear. If another blizzard struck, the whole valley intended to follow Keller's lead. Not the outsider's promises. By November, the first major storm advisory hit the radio. Locals prepared nervously. The memory of last winter still lingered like frostbite scars. People checked their walls, inspected vents, added last-minute insulation. Keller finished reinforcing his outer shell, then stored extra duff in burlap sacks in case the walls needed patching mid-storm. His movements were calm but deliberate. He stacked food inside, made extra kindling, brought water inside. Neighbors who visited sensed it immediately. Keller believed another severe winter was coming. And this time, they didn't laugh. They listened. 2 days before the storm, Keller found footprints near his tool shed, fresh, deep, belonging to boots not worn by anyone in the valley. He knelt beside them, touched the edges, studied the depth. The prints led toward his cabin, then vanished into the forest. Someone had come close. Too close. He didn't tell the neighbors. They had enough to worry about. But he cleaned his rifle, checked the locks twice, and slept lightly. Blizzards weren't the only threat this winter, and some visitors preferred storms to cover their tracks. The blizzard arrived on November 21st. It came down the mountain like a white avalanche of air, flattening bushes and swallowing trails. The valley scrambled to secure homes. Fires roared, curtains shook, walls groaned. But Keller's cabin stood steady. The second wall absorbed the screaming wind, dispersing its force harmlessly. Inside, Keller sat by his lamp with a calm steadiness born of preparation. Around midnight, he heard movement outside, slow, crunching steps. He grabbed his lantern and opened the door. Through the white fog of snow, he saw a figure stumbling toward him, a neighbor, half frozen. "Tom, it's bad," the man gasped. "Our chimney's gone. House dropping fast." Keller didn't hesitate. He brought the man inside, wrapped him in blankets, stoked the fire. As the wind screamed outside, Keller realized the truth. Once again, his strange second wall wasn't just a personal project. It was a lifeline for the valley. And the storm had only begun. The night ahead would test everything. His design, his instincts, and the community that had learned to trust him. And somewhere out in the blizzard, beyond the trees, Keller sensed the presence of someone else watching the cabin. The blizzard struck with a force the valley had never witnessed. Snow didn't fall. It assaulted the land in horizontal sheets, driven by winds powerful enough to tear shingles off roofs. Keller's cabin groaned as the storm tested every seam, every joint, every board. but the double wall held firm, the pine duff cavity absorbing the worst of the cold. Inside, families huddled around the stove, warming numb hands. Children whispered anxiously. Keller moved silently between them, checking blankets, pouring warm broth, securing shutters. He treated the crisis like any other task, methodically, without panic. Leadership came naturally to him now. As the storm intensified, Keller stepped to the window to inspect the drift breaker. Snow piled against it, rising steadily, but the structure performed exactly as designed, diverting the heaviest drifts away from the cabin. He nodded once, satisfied. The wind shifted abruptly, slamming against the western wall with terrifying force. The cabin shuddered but didn't give. The inner room remained eerily calm, as if wrapped in its own pocket of safety. "Your wall is magic," a boy whispered. Keller cracked a faint smile. "It's just smart wood," he replied, though a part of him felt something sacred in the stillness. Around midday, a violent pounding shook the front door. Everyone jumped. Keller opened it just enough to see through the crack. A man stood in the snowstorm, coat buried in frost, face half hidden by blowing ice. It was Bates. "Let me in!" he shouted over the roar. Keller hesitated, hearing neighbors shift behind him. Some yelled, "Don't open it!" But Keller's principles didn't bend. He never left anyone to freeze. With a firm jaw, he unlatched the door and pulled Bates inside. Snow exploded onto the floor. Bates collapsed, coughing, his clothes stiff with ice. As Bates warmed by the fire, families glared. "He's trouble," someone muttered. Keller raised a calming hand. "Storm's bigger than our arguments," he said quietly. Bates eventually caught his breath, eyes darting around the cabin. "You have no idea what's coming," he said. "State wants this design. They'll take it by force if they have to." A tense silence fell. Keller poured him hot water. "Then they'll fail," he replied softly. Bates shook his head. "You don't understand. I tried warning them this storm would make travel impossible, but they didn't listen. They sent a team anyway." The words hung heavy in the warm cabin. "There's a vehicle stuck on the ridge," Bates continued, voice trembling. "3 people. If they stay out there, they won't make it." The room erupted. Some argued that Keller shouldn't risk his life for outsiders who threatened the valley. Others insisted morality outweighed personal grudges. Keller didn't hesitate. "We help," he said. Gasps filled the room. "You'll die out there," someone cried. Keller strapped on his snowshoes and coat, checked his lantern, and tightened his rope. "The mountain doesn't care who we hate," he said. "Only who we save." He stepped into the blizzard. The door slammed shut behind him, muffling the cries of the valley children. Wind tore at his coat, pushing him sideways. Visibility shrank to mere feet. Keller leaned into the gale, using muscle memory and instinct to navigate. He counted paces, felt the slope under his feet, and used tree positions he'd memorized decades ago. Snow burned against his cheeks like shards of glass. The world around him was stripped to white, but Keller moved with purpose. Survival here wasn't just about strength. It was about listening to the mountain's rhythm. Halfway up the ridge, Keller found the vehicle, a state SUV half buried in snow, tilted dangerously toward a ravine. The engine was dead. Frost covered the windows. He banged on the side. A faint voice answered. "Help! Please!" Keller smashed the window with his axe and hauled out the first passenger, a woman nearly frozen. Then a man, barely conscious. The third passenger, a young technician, couldn't feel his legs. Keller secured them with rope, checked their pulses, and wrapped them in emergency blankets. "Stay awake," he commanded. His voice cut through the storm like a steady drumbeat. Pulling them downhill against the wind was brutal. Snow swallowed his boots, legs sinking deep with every step. The rope strained. Twice he nearly lost footing. The ravine yawned nearby, invisible but deadly. The storm screamed in his ears, but Keller pushed forward. He wasn't thinking about danger or gratitude or the valley's future. He thought of one thing only, the responsibility of the prepared. In every dragging step, he repeated silently, "Mountain takes the careless, spares the ready." When the cabin's lantern glow finally appeared through the white curtains, Keller nearly collapsed from relief. Neighbors rushed out to help pull the survivors inside. The warmth hit them like a wave. People wrapped them in blankets, fed them hot broth, massaged their frozen hands. The technician wept openly. We thought we were dead." Bates stood in the corner, eyes lowered, shame heavy on his expression. Keller pulled off his coat and sat quietly, breath still ragged. "Mountain nearly took you," he said, "but not today." For a brief moment, anger melted from the room. Even those who hated the outsiders couldn't deny the humanity of saving them. The storm intensified. Snow climbed the outer wall, burying the lower boards completely. Keller checked vents repeatedly to ensure airflow wasn't blocked. Families took turns tending the fire. Children played card games, their fear eased by the warmth. Bates approached Keller hesitantly. "Why'd you save us, after everything?" Keller shrugged. "Storm doesn't choose its enemies," he said. "Neither do I." Bates swallowed hard. "They'll still try to take your design." Keller looked at him calmly. "Let them try. A wall's only as strong as the hands that build it, and these hands aren't for sale." By nightfall, the storm reached its peak. Winds roared above 100 mph, strong enough to uproot small trees, and the cabin shook violently, then stabilized, the outer wall absorbing the blow. People gasped as they felt the force through the floorboards. The drift breaker caught a massive avalanche of wind-blown snow, redirecting it harmlessly to the side. Keller watched respectfully, whispering, "Good work." The structure responded with silence, the kind of silence only flawless engineering can earn. The storm threw everything it had at the cabin, and the cabin didn't flinch. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed outside. Families jumped. Keller grabbed his lantern and fought against the wind to inspect the damage. A massive fallen pine had crashed near the outer wall, but not through it. The reinforced boards held. The pine duff cavity compressed, then rebounded like a living shield. Keller touched the wall, feeling its warm interior despite the deadly cold outside. "Still breathing," he murmured. He returned inside and reassured everyone. "We'll make it through the night." And they believed him, not because of hope, but because his words had earned weight. As dawn approached, the storm finally weakened. Snowfall slowed to gentle drifts. The wind faded into a whisper. Families stepped outside in stunned silence. The valley was unrecognizable, hidden under frozen waves of white taller than wagons. Many cabins were crushed or buried entirely. Fences disappeared, roads vanished. But Keller's cabin stood like a lone lighthouse in a frozen ocean. Not a single board cracked, not a single vent collapsed. Children cheered. Adults shook their heads, speechless. The mountain had tested the valley again, and once more Keller stood as proof that preparedness outweighs luck. Once the storm stabilized, Keller gathered volunteers. "We dig out the valley," he announced. Neighbors nodded. Bates and the state survivors joined without hesitation. Together, they formed rescue groups, clearing paths between buried cabins, checking for signs of life. They worked for hours. They found 2 families trapped but alive, huddled near makeshift fires. Keller directed efforts calmly, keeping everyone focused, and though exhaustion weighed heavily, unity pushed them forward. In crisis, the valley didn't care about past conflicts. Only survival mattered, and Keller's leadership became the quiet center of every effort. By the 3rd day of digging, the sky cleared entirely. Sunlight bounced off the snow, blinding and beautiful. The valley slowly revealed itself again, damaged, shaken, but alive. Families gathered outside Keller's cabin to thank him. Some hugged him, others simply nodded in quiet gratitude. He took it all with humility. "Storm taught us," he said. "We listened. That's what saved us." But everyone knew the truth. They survived because one man prepared long before others even considered it necessary. Bates approached him later, looking different, lighter, humbled. "I was wrong about everything," he admitted. "Your design, it's genius, but it's also more than that. It belongs here, to these people." Keller studied him for a moment. "You're not here to take anything now," he said. "Good." Bates shook his head. "No. The state will ask questions, but after this, I'll tell them to leave you alone." It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a start. And for Keller, that was enough. As winter stabilized, neighbors completed the rebuilding process together. Keller helped reinforce walls, redig paths, and teach vent maintenance. Children followed him everywhere, eager to learn how wind worked, how snow behaved, how walls breathed. Keller showed them everything, because knowledge, he believed, doesn't weaken when shared. It strengthens the whole community. Soon, families adopted his driftbreaker design too, building their own versions using logs, stones, or old barnwood. The valley slowly transformed, building a legacy inspired by one man's quiet intuition. Weeks later, during a calm evening, Keller sat on his porch sipping warm broth. Snow glittered under the moonlight. The valley was peaceful again. Children sledded in the distance. Smoke curled from repaired chimneys. For the first time in years, Keller felt something like contentment. Not triumph, not pride, just the soft, steady satisfaction of work well done. He looked at his double wall, running his hand along its boards. "You kept your promise," he whispered. The wall didn't answer. It didn't need to. Spring arrived slower this time. Snow melted cautiously, lingering where drifts had formed tall as cabins. The valley held its breath, unsure whether to feel relief or prepare for the next challenge. But when the final ice cracked and green returned to the slopes, residents gathered for a celebration near the general store. Nothing fancy, just food, music, and shared survival. Keller attended reluctantly, pushed by neighbors who insisted. They honored him in speeches, clumsy, heartfelt words about resilience, knowledge, and mountain wisdom. Keller blushed under his hat brim. "I only built a wall," he insisted. "You all survived." But they knew better. It wasn't just a wall. It was foresight, and foresight saved families. That night, someone carved a small wooden plaque depicting a cabin wrapped in a second wall. They hung it on Keller's porch as a quiet tribute. He tried taking it down the next morning, too embarrassed by the attention. But neighbors put it back, laughing. "Mountain honors mountain men," they said. Keller let it stay. As the months passed, the valley changed, not with buildings or roads, but with mindset. People listened to the land. They read signs in wind and wildlife. They prepared early, shared resources, and worked together long before storms arrived. Keller's teachings became unwritten law. Newcomers learned immediately: wall your homes, vent your roofs, layer your insulation light and breathable. By the next winter, no valley cabin was unprotected. The storm had shaped them permanently, transforming fear into caution, chaos into community. One afternoon, Bates returned, not as an intruder, but a friend. He carried a small metal box. "This is for you," he said. Inside was a letter from the state acknowledging Keller's innovative traditional method, granting him full rights to teach and share freely without interference. It wasn't much, but it meant the valley's peace would remain undisturbed. Keller thanked him quietly. Bates lingered. "You saved my life," he murmured. "You saved more than that," Keller replied. "You helped me trust people again." Years passed. The valley flourished. Children grew up learning the same lessons Keller learned as a boy: how to read wind, how to build with intention, how to hear the mountain's warnings. Keller aged gracefully, his hands still strong, his gaze still focused. People continued seeking his advice, even when they knew the answers already. They trusted him not just for his skill, but for his steadfastness, his humility, his unwavering readiness. His double wall became a symbol of resilience, foresight, and the strength of quiet men. One evening, as Keller walked along the ridge at sunset, the wind brushed past his coat in a familiar tone, gentle, warm, harmless. He looked over the valley, dotted with safe, double-walled cabins. Smoke rose peacefully from chimneys. Children played without coats, spring finally breaking fully. He nodded to himself. The mountain had given its final warning years ago, and he had listened. The valley listened too. And because of that, they endured. Keller returned to his cabin, laying a hand on the outer wall one last time before going inside. The boards were weathered, seasoned, strong, like him. The valley no longer feared winter. They respected it. They prepared for it. They learned from it, and they passed that knowledge forward. In the end, Keller didn't seek admiration or reward. He only wanted people to live. And because he built a second wall, strange, mocked, misunderstood at first, the valley survived storms that would have taken everything. His quiet wisdom became legacy. And the mountains, ever watchful, whispered their approval in the wind.